Super Bowl window, of course, wide open when you have a quarterback like Josh Allen, but some questionable decisions by head coach Sean McDermott starting to lead to many questioning if he's the guy to get the Bills to that Super Bowl. I'm Kevin Carroll. Welcome to the Buffalo End Zone Podcast.
And I'm Jon Scott. Popping in during the bye week, Kevin and I were not really expecting ourselves to do a podcast, expecting to be off this week, but not just because of this poll I put out, Kevin. I just think seeing social media, listening to the radio, just talking to people out in the community, the temperature is rising real quick around Sean McDermott. I put out a poll, nearly 2,200 voters, and a resounding 44% of them said Sean McDermott should be fired, and another 30+% said they're on the verge of feeling that way as well. So we're talking, almost 80% of people in a small sample size really unhappy with Sean McDermott right now. And so that's why when you and I just kind of tossed around some text this morning saying, hey, I think it's the best for us to chime in and give our thoughts, which we did a little bit after the Eagles game, but that was more centered specifically to that game. I think, Kevin, it's time to maybe have a broader conversation about McDermott, and that's why we're hopping on here during the bye.
It's amazing at the start of this season with all the hope and the hype and whatever going into this season. We're at this moment right now, John, and I'm one of those guys who have been guilty throughout at least this season for giving Sean McDermott and his defense a pass because the offense was so anemic that I would constantly say, if you go back and look game after game after game when they struggled, what do you want the Bills defense to do at the end of the game? They played their butt off. Offense didn't score enough points. And then some bad teams, John, able to get wins. And I'm not talking about the Eagles. They're the front runner for the Super Bowl right now with just one loss on the season. To the Jets, mind you, which is still something that blows my mind that team lost to the Jets. But just game and game and game, John. They've won 2 of 6 one-score games this year with McDermott at the helm, and I think trusting the process is something that is just gone to the wayside at this point, and it's starting to look like McDermott is one of those coaches that can fix a program, get them to the postseason, but maybe he's not that next-level head coach, John, that can get them to the promised land.
It's funny because depending upon what side of things you are on with McDermott, you can make a case for why it's okay and why it's not okay. You have to look at the full sample size. And certainly, and rightfully so, this all started with 13 seconds. I mean, that's where it started here with McDermott because everything was crescendoing up. And then 13 seconds, this miraculous comeback, and an incredible collapse in 13 seconds to allow a team to blow down the field in 2 plays and kick a field goal to take it to overtime. That's where it began. And I think also people had a really tough time with McDermott on how he handled it. He didn't just come out in the front of things and say, my fault, this is what happened. I think he was trying to protect some people. Maybe he was trying to protect himself. And he never really just stepped in front of things. And and I'm not comparing these two coaches, but Joe Brady in a couple weeks now has pointed the thumb at himself saying, hey, Josh missed Gabe Davis on that option route that would have won the game. That's my fault. I should have better prepared them. We realize that's not honestly the truth, but the coach said that. I think people wanted at 13 seconds for McDermott to take ownership, and it kind of took him a bit to shoulder some of that. He was a little too vague, I think, for people, and that was the start of it. And then obviously how the season ended a year ago with the Bengals game where, they got out-coached, they got outplayed, and that was one of the rare times that we've seen in McDermott's tenure. They were dominated. They were dominated on all facets of the game. So then you carry things over to this year, and you're right. These close losses to bad teams, I think, is really what has then taken us to this point here. So then, Kevin, I would just ask you plain and simple, if you were voting in that poll the 4 options, what did you pick and why?
I picked I'm not there yet, John, but starting to lean that way because eventually you have to call it like you see it. You and I often talk about the eye test and whatnot, and how many years are you going to go through this? We have a really good team. Maybe we can get into the playoffs this year. Maybe they even can't get into the playoffs where they are right now. But you go look at those Bengals teams with Andy Dalton, and they were there every year during the regular season, looked good, and just could not do it. Do you want to deal with that? I mean, what are we in, year 7 now with Sean McDermott? Do you want 3 more years of being a team that on paper should be dominant, looks dominant at times, but maybe gets to the playoffs, loses in the first round? I mean, such promise at the beginning, but then once the rest of the league catches up with you, you need to change gears. You need to do something else. What Sean McDermott is doing in his approach seems to be just wearing thin right now, I think, with how they're approaching games and how they're looking at the season. And again, you go back to last year and you get the whole thing with the injuries and Damar Hamlin and the snowstorm that moved the game out to Detroit. So they were in Detroit 2 weeks in a row. And you give McDermott a lot of credit for that. But yeah, you go back to that game against the Bengals and how bad they looked and how that trickled over to this season when it really shouldn't have. And let the season's got to play out. I wouldn't move on from Sean McDermott now. But man, if they don't get to the postseason, if they don't pull one out of their butts right now coming down the stretch with 5 games to go, I think you would have to seriously take a long, hard look at what you want the future of this team to look like and if you want to keep going down this road, because it's almost like you say the 13 seconds game, you know, the year before that they were in the AFC Championship. It's been a step backwards year after year after year. AFC Championship, divisional round, and maybe no playoffs at all. So maybe Sean McDermott has done what he can do with this team, and now someone else needs to be brought in to put them over the hump.
I am in the large minority in the poll. I would have probably put lukewarm. I certainly agree that Sean McDermott warrants criticism, and I'm good with it dating back to 13 seconds and the lack of progression and steps back and some of his in-game decision-making. 100%. I am not debating that with anyone that maybe feels that he should be more on the outs than I do. For me, I also see some of the positives. I mean, I think the defense has done well. They just have not gotten it done when it matters. And that's certainly on Sean McDermott as well, and some of the calls he's making. I mean, certainly we discussed it right after the Eagles game. The Eagles defense saw the look that they were given on the Jalen Hurts run and knew from the minute that they saw it that he was going to score. And McDermott said the day after that he called the zero blitz because, hey, we just felt that this was the only way we could stop him. And it was just a weird decision that's where he decides to go all in. And then you also discussed it, kind of playing soft on the field goal drive early that allowed them to rip off some yards at the front end of that drive. The not going for it on 4th and 6, the not deciding to make a shot with 20 seconds left, calling the timeout to freeze the kicker, which seemed unnecessary. That's just one isolated game that you could keep going even back to 2017. In the snow game, they had to win to stay alive in the playoff hunt, and McDermott is punting with under 2 minutes to go or 3 minutes to go, where a tie in that game would have eliminated them from the playoffs. And you're like, okay, he got away with it, but what in the hell was he doing, right? I mean, that's dating back to 2017 and arguably the best coaching job that he's done as the Bills head coach. Still, I know it sounds like I'm building this case to be on the other side. I maybe take more of a conservative approach with coaches. And I feel that I try to take a broader, non-emotional look at it and say, listen, Sean McDermott has guided this team into a perennial power. Maybe some will say that's because of Josh Allen. I think McDermott has done some coaching as well. And to me, I'm fall more into the conversation of now or never next season. I feel that he deserves next season, and that's when I will get to maybe the point that you are. But I do understand this element of it as well. There's some good coaches that are going to be part of this hiring cycle, especially some offensive minds. Ben Johnson of Detroit is a hot name. And if you feel that, one, it is best for Josh Allen to get an offensive head coach who then you're not yo-yoing maybe coordinators every couple of years, because if they're successful, they're going to go get a head coaching job. If they're not, they're going to get fired. So if you want consistency with the most important person surrounding the most important player on your team, I get it. Okay, so that would maybe be, I understand that. What are your thoughts on the idea of they need to make a move, get an offensive guy strictly for Josh Allen?
I guess I would think if you're moving on from Sean McDermott, I would go with an offensive mind. I think for McDermott himself, as we are in the here and now, I think him taking over as defensive coordinator, as much as I'm going to sit here and say that, there's some questionable decisions made by him, I like the defense a lot better this season than what it was last year with Leslie Frazier as the defensive coordinator. I just think the pass rush is better. McDermott's making a lot out of nothing. But the problem I'm having with it is you can use the game against the Eagles as kind of this bigger picture of what you're getting from McDermott's defenses this year, is that a great game plan coming in. But come the second half, there just seems to be issues constantly. And I know I'm not really answering your question right now, John, but the bottom line is if I were to go after a coach, I would go offensive-minded 100% moving forward if you're moving on from Sean McDermott. I mean, I think you kind of need that when you have a stud quarterback right now like the Bills do with Josh Allen to maybe get to that next level. So if I'm leaning now towards moving on from McDermott, then the long answer from what I've been trying to get to is I think offensive-minded is totally the way to go. And, I mean, that's the NFL right now. It's offense, offense, offense. You don't need the Ravens defense from 2000 or the Bears from 85. You don't.
Nobody has those. The interesting thing I think about McDermott deciding to be the defensive play caller is I agree the defense is better, but I do think there could be an argument made that his ability to be the all-encompassing, seeing over everything leader of the Bills as the head coach has suffered because he's had to focus more on the defense. I think, imagine if they had fired Ken Dorsey after the Tampa game or after the Cincinnati game, and you start seeing what the Bills' offense is now against the Denver Broncos. That's just one extra win that at 7-5, the outlook of the Bills and making the postseason is drastically different than as they sit here in the bye week at 6-6. The decision to fire Ken Dorsey and pulling the trigger whenever that was is solely on Sean McDermott. And I'm not saying if he's not the defensive play caller, maybe he makes the move earlier or whatnot, but that's also an indictment on him as the main leader and decision maker of the Buffalo Bills. And we've seen special teams penalties, like in the Denver game, special teams mishaps, like in the Jets game, the way they lost it, and just a lack of detail, so many penalties, so many we hear poor execution. Are the fundamentals maybe sharper if Sean McDermott is able to focus on everything rather than divide his time, maybe 50% defense, 50% everything else? I think that's also a criticism and a talking point in this, that as good as I think we both agree the defense has looked and we like the changes that McDermott has made in the saddle as the play caller, maybe it's had an adverse effect on everything else on the team, and that's also contributing as maybe the defense has stayed afloat with all the injuries. Maybe the other two phases of the game have been hurt by McDermott not being the all-encompassing and having his time to look at everything else.
Wasn't that one of the big questions we had, at least during training camp or our preseason special that we did? Was one of the top 10 storylines was how was Sean McDermott going to handle being defensive coordinator and head coach? And I think we can both agree right now. I mean, what would you give it? Like a C, C minus right now on how it's, I don't know if I'm misrecalling things, but I could have sworn at least seeing something on TV or hearing something at a press conference at least a couple of times that, well, I was over talking to the defense when that happened. Am I making that up? Is that something?
No, that's true. There are moments where he has had to do that, and that's why, like, Matthew Smiley has been someone that's kind of assumed some of the responsibilities in those moments in game where McDermott has to actually give his devoted attention to the defense. That's a fair point.
Yeah, and I'm not giving him an out on that. It's just when you take over that responsibility of the dual role, I mean, I guess that was the big question going into the season was could he handle it? Excuse me. I got a bad cough, John. We got to hang in here for a half an hour. I got a cough drop in. But it just doesn't, the eye test says this isn't working. The special teams issues, like you said. I don't know what kind of freedom Joe Brady has over Ken Dorsey, but it does look like night and day with how the offense is running right now. And I don't know, if that's taking up less of his time, but obviously it's the head coach's call to take a knee with 20 seconds left in regulation, which was so frustrating, John, to see a decision made like that when you were part of that 13-second game. You have a quarterback in comparison to Patrick Mahomes. You have weapons out there. They did it, like I said after the game, in the Detroit game last year on Thanksgiving. And even if Tyler Bass, who struggled, doesn't hit the field goal, you at least made an effort to do it. And to give up like that really sits in my craw as we go into the bye week on just why you wouldn't even try. And the reasoning was, well, we didn't want, a strip sack to happen and the ball come out, which didn't happen all afternoon. So I just, you look back at that and it's something that you'd love to see how it would have played out with a more aggressive coach. I hated it. I still hate it. I'm probably going to, just from what this team has been through, there's no way that should have been the decision made. And that kind of encapsulates some of what's gone on against the Broncos and the loss there. Not being able to stop Mac Jones and the Patriots. I mean, that's good. I talked about the Eagles losing to the Jets. Any team losing to what the Patriots are putting out there on the field right now should just be embarrassed that they did. And the Bills had to come back in that game.
Yeah, it was brutal here. I think also, and I alluded to it after 13 seconds when I was discussing that earlier in the show, I think also people just, they don't like the way McDermott explains things. They don't.
That's true.
They either don't like it. They don't like how vague he is. It's not Belichickian, but now you're passing it along to me.
Sorry.
I just think it's, if he was more forthcoming and just upfront with certain things, I think maybe people would not be so ready to kick him out the door. I think we can wrap up with this, though, Kevin. We've given our opinions of what we would do, what we think should be done. I think we can wrap it up with what we believe the Bills' Terry Pegula will do at the end of this season. And I'm here to tell you, Sean McDermott's not going anywhere. I mean, I would be shocked. I mean, absolutely, utterly shocked if Sean McDermott was fired after this season. He was just given a contract extension in the summer that coincides with Brandon Beam. And Terry Pegula, number one owner of any professional sports team, was hire Sean McDermott, who then helped get Brandon Beam, and then this ship has rolled in. Then he pulls Kevin Adams out of his behind And everyone's thinking, what is happening? This guy is no experience. And at least from a talent acquisition standpoint, that's worked out. And this is not a Sabres podcast, but I think it's right to maybe question if Don Granado's the right guy at this point in time and might be a lesser version of Sean McDermott, a guy that can elevate you to a certain point, but they need to make a move to push forward. Again, different show, but I'm just painting the full landscape of you don't keep Sean McDermott strictly because you're afraid of what Terry Pegula may or may not be able to reel in to replace him. And you shouldn't keep Sean McDermott strictly because he's better than anything the organization predating Terry Pegula has had since Marv Levy. I'm just saying a new contract, his overall track record, I just feel like Terry is not going to be willing, and again, I say I don't think he should, to move on from Sean McDermott after just one bad season out of 7.
I think I'll go with this. I think it honestly, in my opinion, depends on how the rest of the season plays out. If we see the Bills team that we've seen the last 2 weeks dominating bad teams and hanging in there with the good teams, no, you keep Sean McDermott around. You give the coach the benefit of the doubt that, this was just an off year, and you go into next season with him and see what happens. And quite frankly, just gut feeling, John, as we sit here on the bye week with 5 games to go and you look at the rest of the schedule, I think if you get that effort like you got against the Eagles the rest of the way or something close to it, you could beat the Chiefs. You could beat the Cowboys. You certainly could beat the Chargers. If you lost to the Patriots twice this year, maybe then you should fire Sean McDermott, John.
All right, I'll go with you on that one.
But then you get it to that final game with the Dolphins and put all your chips in and if that needs to be a de facto playoff game, so be it. Hopefully that's not the case by the time you get there. Then that's a different story. But if you come out of the bye week and you come out flat in Kansas City and then Dallas comes to Buffalo and knocks you around a little bit, then I think you inch more and more to how long can we let this go on?
I think the Bills aren't making the playoffs. I think they probably go 3-2 to end it, which I think all things considered, if you said, hey, at the beginning of the year, you'll finish 3-2 with that gauntlet of games, I think that would be good. But I think 9 wins gets you in a lot of tiebreaker scenarios, and the Bills, they've dug themselves a hole with those bad losses in the AFC to Denver, New England, and the Jets. So I think you're absolutely right. I think they'll win one of these Kansas City or Dallas games. I think they'll beat New England. I think they could beat the Chargers, or they could certainly beat the Dolphins. I mean, they could win any of these games. I think that's the weird dynamic of the Philly game of if we're 7-5 going into the bye week and you just saw them lose to Philadelphia that way, you'd probably be more encouraged rather than discouraged and on the outs and calling for Sean McDermott and all of this stuff here. But I agree. As we sit here in the bye week, I think they're going to go 3-2 to finish the season, finish 9-8, and ultimately miss the playoffs in a tiebreaker scenario. And Sean McDermott remains the head coach still.
All right. I have them getting to the 10 wins and getting in. And again, just a gut feeling, but while we're just sitting here, Kansas City, Bills, that's a big game. Cowboys, they kick the crap out of horrible teams and don't do well against teams that are even decent to good. And then the rest of the way, it is what it is. So, I mean, that remains to be seen. You got the Chiefs coming up next. Once again in Kansas City. I'm losing it. Time to go, John. In Kansas City a week from Sunday, Bills on the bye week. John and I will be back here next week following Media Day next Wednesday to get you ready for the return of the Bills in a big Bills-Chiefs game. And here we come down the home stretch. For Jon Scott, I'm Kevin Carroll. Thanks for joining us, everyone.